Welcome to Capital Courage, where politics meets bold ideas and fearless conversations.
We're here to break down the biggest stories in Virginia and across the country with hot takes, real talk, and a little fun along the way.
Whether it's policy fights, political showdowns, or leaders making waves,
we're diving into the courage it takes to stand up, speak out, and shake things up.
So let's get into it. This is Capital Courage with Rena and Ryan.
Welcome to another episode of Capital Courage. As we promised, we were going to dive into the topic that everybody loves to talk about and hear about these days, which is data centers. And if you are in Virginia or know anything about what's going on in Virginia politics these days, you know that we almost shut down our state government over data centers. So it is truly not hyperbole to say this is the biggest issue in our state these days, and thrilled to have with us today to talk about data centers. The wonderful Jay Ford, who you may know from, aside from just General Assembly world, you may know him from Twitter if you're a listener here, where he's got a great presence. Jay, welcome. Thanks for joining the pod.
Thanks so much for having me, Ryan. I'm glad to join you and talk about data centers. Can't avoid talking about them, so might as well do it with a friend.
You really can't. Do you wish you were talking about them less these days?
No, I'm glad we're talking about them as much as we are, because it means people are paying attention. And, I worry about conservation and environmental issues that no one is talking about. That's when you have a problem. But the fact that our legislature, that citizens are so tuned in on potential impacts to the Commonwealth as a result of this build out, I think that's a positive thing. And the more eyeballs you have on a conversation, on a topic, the more honest the outcomes, and people are paying attention. So I think overall it's a good thing. But of course I hope we can get to some resolutions here in Virginia so we can talk about other great things.
Yeah. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and assume that most people that are watching this podcast know the basics of the data center fight, and so we'll jump into kind of a next level type of question of, you mentioned resolution. I'm curious to hear your perspective, and to share with folks why, especially with the work that you do in your day job, working on water quality, environmental conservation. Why have data centers become such a problem now? Because they've been around for decades in general, but what makes this period that we're in right now so unique and so harmful?
Yeah, like most environmental challenges, you start with something that could be relatively low impact, and it becomes an issue of scale over time. And so when we, were in the baby steps of data centers back, 2007, 2008, no one could tell you what a data center was. And the idea that we would have a little bit of a tax credit in the budget to help incentivize this nascent industry, it made a lot of sense. It was really appealing. And so that the General Assembly made that decision. And at the time, their own numbers said, this might keep about 2 million from going into state coffers. But the trade-off for localities is going to be huge. Now we put that number closer to 2 billion. And that's the sort of a magnitude of scale that nobody could have imagined. And that is driven largely because of the boom in AI. So back when we were talking about data centers before, it was powering your Google Maps. It was, maybe there's a social media app on there. But now, well over 60% of the build out in data centers is for enterprise applications. So what's really driving this exponential growth is for AI tools that businesses can utilize, sometimes to replace labor, sometimes to create more efficiencies. But there's been a significant shift in what the purpose of data centers are, and also the scale of the build out. So, we are now the data center capital of the world here in Virginia, and there is a tremendous amount of economic benefit to some of the host localities. But there is also a tremendous impact on natural resources, because when you look at what a data center ultimately is, like, why it locates in a community, they don't scout across the country and say, do we have, is there a talent pool of people that can do maintenance here? They look across the country and they say, I need access to, internet infrastructure, I need cheaper free water, and I need cheap electricity. And so I think people need to understand that, yes, the tax credit was a big part of locating here, but it's also how cost effective it is to use resources. And so that's really what drives these decisions. And so when it was just a few, there wasn't that concern about, are they going to use too much water? Are they going to, have impacts on our electrical rates or local air quality? Now we're at a scale where every single facility could meet the letter of the law in its permit, but when taken in totality, it outstrips our resources. And so it's that cumulative impact of these facilities all being located within specific regions that is really driving these regions.
Yeah. You bring up you bring up many interesting points. One I want to follow up on is, you mentioned what motivates a data center operator to locate in Virginia versus somewhere else. A thing that I think we saw a lot from data center supporters in recent months, certainly the budget fight in particular, was this concern. Perhaps it's inflated or false, even, that if we don't incentivize data centers to stay here, they're going to leave Virginia. We're going to have, scores of, if not hundreds of empty vacant buildings, and maybe the building's been built, but they're going to take all their equipment. They're going to go to some other state. But to your point, it's a unique industry. Like, they are not buildings or an industry that require much human effort. They don't. I mean, the jobs conversation is a different one, but even supporters will admit, once they're open, there are not that many jobs involved in sustaining these things during their operation. So they're not looking for talent pool workforce, but they're looking for physical assets of the place. So to your point, like, they're not going to go, maybe like you think about a place with a lot of land, they're not going to go in less developed states because those states don't have as much internet infrastructure, to your point. Would be curious just to hear, like, your perspective on kind of some of the claims like that we heard from data center supporters in recent months.
Yeah. Look, at every business and every company's different, and they're all going to make decisions based on their bottom line. I think this is not a unique instance where, when you start talking about potential regulation or changes to tax structures, that businesses say, I'll leave. The long-term data on this discussion across every sector in human history is very rarely does everyone leave. Like, almost never. So like, everyone's just gonna take their data center, their like massive campus, and just go rebuild it somewhere else.
Yeah.
And reset that whole process. It's very, very don't want to say it's not made in earnest, but I suspect there's a good amount of hyperbole in those statements. And so, this idea that you're going to find some golden place that would give you such a sweetheart deal that it would be worth rebuilding an entire campus structure, going through the permitting process, having two facilities running at one time where you try to maintain both. That is a very unrealistic scenario. And when you look around the country right now, like, we have a whole state putting a moratorium on them. We have scores and scores of towns, localities, counties, different size government entities putting restrictions in place. It's not like there's some golden land where everyone's going to be cool with you not following any environmental standards or paying an appropriate amount of taxes. And so I do think those claims are overblown, and I think that's a question that Virginia needs to also wrestle with. Yes, we don't want to lose existing footprint, but we also don't want to hold on to to any industry to the detriment of our drinking water or electrical bills that are unsustainable for Virginians. And I think that is striking that right balance is what we need to do here in the Commonwealth, and figure out, how do we get appropriate standards in place that are going to be protective of Virginians and their water and their air quality and their electric bills, which just keep going up, and while also, holding on to these entities that are driving significant tax revenue for the localities they're located in. And so that is the balancing act the state has to walk, and it's one that we're really hopeful we're going to get settled in 27. We were hopeful we were going to get it settled this year, and unfortunately, we really punted on almost every major question when it came to data center. So,
Yeah. Was that this might sound like a weird question, but was the punting a surprise to you, that that's kind of how it ended up in the end after such prolonged budget discussions?
no, I don't want to sound jaded, but I've worked in the environmental sector for a long time. We are usually pretty low on the totem pole. And so when someone says we're going to do, there's a revenue option on the table, the environment's usually below that. And so I wasn't shocked to find out that once we figured out, 1.2 billion in new revenues, that environmental standards would be pushed off to another day. And disappointed, deeply disappointed, but I do think this has been such a tough thing to wrap your mind around if you're the average citizen that has a data center in your community, because people have been flooding town halls, they've been flooding their legislators' offices, writing op-eds, writing letters, and the message is the same. It's protect our water, protect my electrical bill, safeguard us from the noise, deal with the fact that this is disconnecting our communities. They're all resource and environmental concerns. And so I do think it's just wild that the General Assembly said, yeah, we hear you 100%. We're not going to do anything on any of that, but we did get this kind of deceptively named consumption tax out of them. And I say deceptively named because, yes, it's pegged to how much energy they consume, but it doesn't go to remedy the issue of driving up electrical bills. It just went into general funds. So if you're
also capped, so they could use as much as they want and just say, oh, well.
So if you're a citizen going well, they said they did something, and you go back to your card of things you've listed, none of them have been addressed. So it's a really frustrating dynamic, not just for NGOs like us, but just for Virginians who are saying, you did not come up with a substantive solution to any of the things I complained about. But you keep saying you did something. So it's not that happens a lot in Richmond, but I do think it's an important aspect to this dynamic now. And that because this dragged to July 1, essentially, we'll be at pre-file for the next General Assembly before we know it. And people are angry that they didn't see substantive changes. So I think, and I hope, that legislators are ready to roll up their sleeves and actually address these issues in the 27 session, because people want clean energy standards. They want safeguards for their drinking water. They want to know that data centers are not going to continue to drive up their electric bills. And if we can't answer those basic questions, you tax somebody all you want, but like the citizens, the people that you're responsible to, are not happy. They're not satisfied with that answer. So I hope legislators have taken that to heart and are gearing up for a productive 2027 session.
Yeah, we hope so. Um, you mentioned, obviously this is not a problem unique to Virginia, even though we're uniquely harmed by it compared to other states or even other countries, for that matter. But it's something that we certainly see this in research done across the country is that this is one of the few issues that has unique bipartisan appeal. You see interviews with voters right now in midterm elections across the country that might be, you might suspect this issue would be typically a more left-leaning issue, but you see a lot of Republican voters showing up to their local town halls fighting these things, saying, I don't care about anything else. I'm going to vote for the Democrat in the midterms if they're going to be anti-data center. Um, Love to hear more from you about like how you've seen that dynamic play out, especially elected officials. Like because like we see that so often with issues that we work on in our day jobs, is like regular people, bipartisan people support a thing, but you don't always see that translate into bipartisan elected officials actually having the courage to act on
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. I guess let me just first say, when we think about who's really leading on this, obviously Senator Louise Lucas comes to mind. I mean, she has really taken this to the people directly and made this issue for right in the forefront of people's minds. But Republican Senator Richard Stewart has been on this topic and really before anybody else was. I mean, this week we saw headlines of the governor and others asking the SEC to make the data centers pay for their own transmission costs. It's a completely reasonable thing. It's something Senator Stewart already had legislation on, but before it was cool. So, when I think about the bipartisan aspect, he's a really good example. And the attributes that stand out to me are what I call sort of the capital C conservation. A lot of times partisanship, if you say it's environmental, people go into one camp or the other. But in Virginia, and I think this has always been bipartisan, the idea of conservation of resources, that is just a across the board bipartisan Republican and Democrat issue.
Mm-hmm.
And Senator Stewart has been bullish on the fact that there are limited groundwater resources, and something he's worked on for over a decade at this point. And there's limited land, and there are, we have got to take this conservation charge that the legislature has very serious. And so I think it's really around that concept that we've seen bipartisanship come forward. And because our most vocal advocates, both on the Dem and on the Republican side, are coming out of rural districts. If you think about the Senate, we see Senator Perry, and we see Senator McPike and others who are taking leadership positions. And these are folks that still have rural aspects to their district. We do have rural Dems. And we have Republicans like Senator Stewart who they're looking at the land use in their district. They're looking at their wells and the very character of their districts changing overnight with these impacts. And so I think that has really been the bipartisan thread, is that these folks realize this is a natural resource consumption issue. And that at core, that's what data centers are looking for, is cheap water, cheap electricity, and that those come with impacts to your respective districts. And so I've been very heartened by it. I think it has actually opened up space for a more bipartisan discussion on energy writ large in Virginia. We still have our lightning rods. You say Reggie, everyone goes to their separate camps. but we're finally at a point in the energy space where there is bipartisan consensus that transmission, substations to data centers, that is driving electrical costs. No, I've not met a legislator who would deny that. And if they did, let me be blunt, they're wrong. It is in fact driving up electrical costs. And so I think that is a really promising space for us right now in Virginia, that we have both Republicans and Democrats coming to the table to talk about these big picture energy questions. And that hasn't happened a lot in the past. So if there's a silver lining here, it's that everyone can agree we have to do something about data centers, Republican or Democrat. So
Yeah.
it's bringing people together, our data centers.
There's a silver lining to everything. I'm willing to. There's got to be one here if you look hard enough. Um, One of my maybe last question for you is, you mentioned water supply, and obviously it's been, we're recording this in mid-July. It's been uniquely in the news recently that Virginia and most of the country, honestly, is in the middle of a drought. We've seen the governor um, visit the Roanoke Valley this week to talk about, particular acute conditions there, and wrestle with the question of mandatory water conservation. I'd be curious, just because I feel like while data centers are on everybody's mind all year round, water feels like it's uniquely part of the conversation now, and especially with your day job, if you can break down um, some of the, like, I feel like you see, I see kind of from both sides recently. Like, there've been videos on social media. There was one that went semi-viral of Henrico County supposedly asking schools to conserve water, turn lights off. Some would say maybe not doing that for data centers in the county. If you could kind of talk through, like, what data center water usage looks like, and what you think they need to do better with it.
Sure. The first thing is there's no one answer to that. There's a lot of different technologies that go into data centers that can make their water usage highly variable between facilities. I think you rightly point out that we're sort of at a unique moment right now in Virginia. We have multiple historic tributaries. The Rappahannock. These tribs are at historic low levels. Last year we saw islands in the Potomac that people haven't laid eyes on in 100 years. We are asking people to not wash their cars or water their vegetable garden, and all of this is sort of against this backdrop of, can we at least get the data centers to use conservation practices? And so a lot of folks may have seen in the veto session or the budget session, there was really strong comments on the floor about the governor's amendments on this language when it comes to data center, what they're calling cooling water scarcity areas. That language, it's a good first step. Let me just say that first and foremost. Was the previous language stronger? Yes. But is this a important step forward? Yes, and we need to see what DEQ actually produces, because the budget language they landed on really gives DEQ a lot of discretion to develop both the geographic region that will have these water conservation practices, and gives them some latitude to sort of determine which practices qualify. So, making sure and keeping eyes on what the agency's process is in the intervening months is going to be really important. When it comes to data center water usage, they don't have to use a ton of water. Many choose to because of the economics. And so what we were really getting hung up on in the budget process is this phrase direct evaporative cooling. And that is when you're running water over heated elements and using evaporation to sort of take the heat out of the facility. It's basically a giant swamp cooler. And it is one of the cheapest ways to cool equipment, but evaporative is in the name. So it is using water on a one-way street where in some applications, at least 50% of that water is going to evaporate off. And so you've taken that water completely out of that local system. Mm-hmm. And so that is one of the most water intensive uses. As you sort of go down the continuum of cooling techniques, there are much less water intensive approaches. But here's the rub. They use more energy. So there's been this really unfortunate inverse relationship between water usage and energy usage. And, we want to address both. And so what they're really trying to get at with this identification of water scarcity or water cooling scarcity areas, don't quote me on that phrase, is where are those areas in Virginia where groundwater is already under stress, surface water withdrawals are already compounding to create water stress. And that way we know where we have to prioritize water conservation. And then, so this will include all of the Eastern Virginia groundwater management areas, but it gave the agency flexibility to bring in additional areas like parts of the Rappahannock, where we're, again, seeing historic low levels of water and a lot of requests for surface water withdrawal, where it might not be a good idea to keep doing this, folks. And spoiler, it's not. So those are the areas we need to be able to focus our water conservation efforts. And really, we need to work on the energy efficiency, clean energy requirements, and emissions reduction across all of these facilities. But that was the thinking. Did it go as far as everyone would like? Absolutely not. Is it the solution on water in the budget is really the only area I can say we have taken a concrete first step. We will have a regulatory process ongoing. They will come out with a report. I think the frustration on the energy side is that there are no guarantees. There's just a guarantee to talk about it. And that historically, that kind of delay has never gone well for conservation groups. That's another whole year of time for people to lobby, for people to come up with 1,000,001 excuses why we shouldn't take extra steps.
Well, hopefully, like you said, personally, I know no other way to be, despite my field of choice in my profession. I know no other way to be than eternally optimistic. I think to your point, seeing how intense, organic, growing, plugged in regular people are in the opposition is to this. Hopefully 27, when all 140 people in the legislature are up for election, they might listen more to people. We shall see. Thanks for joining us today, Jay. We'll and stay tuned to the pod for more on this topic, everyone's favorite. And I think to your point, with all the paradigm shifts, it's kind of the biggest. So again, thanks for joining us. That's a wrap on this episode of Capital Courage.
If you like what you heard, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your politically savvy, and maybe not so savvy, friends about us.
Join us for new episodes, new takes, and plenty of fearless conversations.
Until next time, stay bold, stay informed, and keep showing up where it matters.
See you next time on Capital Courage with Rena and Ryan.